Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to create a cookbook kind of app in Xcode for an iPhone. This time we're going to use the new SwiftData. So let's go iOS app to begin with, hit next. We're actually going to use the drop down for SwiftData here, but we're not including Cloud Quit or anything. Language is Swift, interface is Swift UI. You can leave TM none if you don't have a developer ID, that's fine. I'm going to use mine. It's not going to make a difference here. Let's call this recipes. So this is what this is going to do. This is going to load a list, and I'm just going to put this on the desktop for now. So what this app is going to do, it's actually going to read through a list of recipes, and it's going to save it into like a model container with a list of like saved recipes. Okay, so here's our app, and we'll just wait for it to load. Okay, so our app is loaded. So at the moment, you can see it uses timestamp. So it just creates a date and saves that to our data store using this plus button to begin with. Looks a bit different. So what happens is it sets up a shared container, then adds it as a model container to the window group, the whole app. And then from any view, to access it, we have to use the model context environment, and then we query for our list of items. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new menu item. So at the moment we have this item with a timestamp and date. So let's go File, New, File. Because we're looking at a model, we're just using a Swift file. Let's call this menu item. So we're going to use the new model, and we're actually going to need SwiftData as well. And we're going to go for a final class menu item. We're going to create a variable for the recipe name. So I'm going to assume that each recipe has a unique name, and that's how I'm going to save it. And so this app is going to save recipes per day of the week. So the next one I'm going to have is day as a string as well. You could have created this as an enumeration or an enum and have a finite list of weekdays. Now, the new Xcode is really good because you can just use this and it auto-completes for the initializer. That's basically done for our menu item. So I'm actually going to remove item. I'm just going to delete this one. And when I build, it should throw some errors so then I can retrace the item. So I'm actually going to go for menu item instead. So if you didn't want to trace the error, you can actually just jump into the app view with a shared model container, and we're looking for menu items. It's really important at this stage that in my simulator, I haven't created any items or anything like that because it won't be able to read the items very well then. That's basically all of the changes that we've had to make for now with our saved data. So the next thing I'm going to do is, as I mentioned before, I'm actually going to create a new Swift file. This is going to be called weekdays. And I'm going to create a list of days. Let's build again. There's another error with items. So this is a problem with our items being menu item. So now we're actually in the view, in content view. Now it's going to throw some errors here in my list. So for now, I'm just going to remove all of this and remove my toolbar. And I actually don't like the navigation split view either. So I'm just going to put some text for now. Hello world. I'm going to not need any of these functions for now either. So I'm going to delete all of that. And so we just have the content view for a menu item. I'm going to build again. That looks better. And so we just got a hello world, a basic blank view for now. So back in our weekdays, now we can actually add our weekdays. So I'm going to go enum day as a string, and I want it to be case iterable. What that means is I can create a list of these days. I'm going to start the week from Sunday, Monday, and Saturday. So now we have our days and they're strings, so you can unwrap them as strings as well. And then that way the user only has a set list of weekdays that they can choose from. The next thing we're going to do is import some data. So for that, I'm actually going to grab our data file. Okay, so here's my data file. This came, this is a CSV file format. This came from GitHub, so someone else created this for me. So I've got my title of my recipe, my directions, and then across this way, after all the directions, we've got our ingredients, our quantities, our units, and then our next ingredient, quantity and units, and so on. So this is actually quite a wide spreadsheet, and it's actually quite dense as well. There's quite a lot of data to work with here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pass over all of that data. To begin with, I'm going to drag this file into my Xcode project, and I'm just going to drop it in somewhere in here. I need to copy it in and add it to the target so it adds to the runtime. I'm also going to create a new group with our models, another one with our views. Now at the moment, both folders are empty, so I'm going to put my recipes, my weekdays, my menu items all in models, and then my content view into views. It's kind of just going to give me some structure here. So when you look at recipes, you can see these are all the details about the recipe. So I'm actually going to cheat a little bit with this. I'm going to go into Microsoft Word, and I'm going to create a new blank document, and I'm going to paste this list in. Then I'm going to find and replace. Okay, so I'm going to find my commas, and I'm going to replace with the little hat, which is Shift-6, and P for paragraph. When I replace them, it puts them on the new line for me. So that's really handy. So I've got all of my recipe kind of pieces from the directly from the spreadsheet from the header, assuming that this matches our data source. So then I'm going to create a new Swift file. This one is now going to be called a recipe. Here it is here. That matches our recipes. So I'm going to create a class called recipe, and it's going to be identifiable. So to begin with, to make it identifiable, I'm going to just assign some ID. And I'm not going to recall that ID directly, so that's fine like that. Then I'm going to paste that list. That's all come from directly from Microsoft Word. I've just edited out all the commas in here. I don't need that anymore. Okay, so now using the multi-line cursor, so this is something new in Xcode, we can hold Option and we can click and drag all the way up and we can create a multi-line cursor. So we can create let constants. I can jump to the end using command and the right arrow button. And I'm going to assign them to be different things. So it depends what they are. So the most common one is going to be a string for now. And then when we're going to go quantity, I'm going to make that an integer. So I'm just going to replace every time it says quantity with an integer. And if we catch any, like if there's any quantities that aren't there, like we can fix that later. So I'm going to do the same again for the next kind of batch. So hold Option, click and drag all the way up, let, and then command right button, and then type string. And then my quantities are going to be integers again. So quantity is integer, quantity, 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 and so on. And then the last batch. Now to make it easier as well, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to break this up. So I've got my ID, and I'm going to keep my title and my direction separate. And then I'm going to go quantity, unit, ingredient, and then quantity, unit, ingredient. And I'm just going to check the quantities in integer each time. And I'm just going to space it out a little bit so it makes it a little bit easier to read. Okay, that looks pretty good. And our last one is category. So we have all of this data here. So it actually is complaining that there's no initializers. So again, rather than retyping all of this as our initializers, I'm just going to go init and it's going to default for me. So I'm going to press return and it populates it for me. Beautiful. I'm going to build to make sure there's no errors for now. Lovely. From there, I'm going to put some functions in here. This is now more to do with the recipes CSV. So I'm going to create my own function called clean rows. This is a bit of an old function, this one. It's going to take the file as a string and return a string. So it's just going to like clean some things up. Clean file. I'm going to create a local copy of the file that we've imported. And then I'm going to reassign it as clean file, replacing occurrences of, and anything that says R for like new row, I'm going to replace with N for new line. Now, once I've done that, I'm going to then copy that and paste it below, but this time I'm going to look for double new lines and replace with a single new line. Finally, I'm going to return, the file. So again, build, no problems. Now we get into a little bit more interesting. We're loading our list of recipes. So I'm going to create a function called load recipes. And it's going to return a list, an array of recipe. So to begin with, just so there's no errors, I'm going to create a variable called list of recipes. And it's going to be a blank list of recipe. There's no plural here because this is actually just this structure here. So we're going to have an array or a blank list of these. Whoops. And then just to get rid of this missing return, I'm going to return that list of recipes. Build, no errors, so ready to keep going. So the first thing I'm going to do is look for this file. And to do that, I'm going to not always assume that the file is going to be there. Now you'll notice mine's recipes, lowercase r, and it's a CSV document. So I'm going to use a guard. I'm going to look in the bundle, main, path, for resource. There it is. Recipes. So it matches this, and it's of type CSV. Now, if it can't find it, I'm then going to put an else in there. I'm going to print, whoops, error, file not found. And if that's the case, I'm going to return a blank list of recipes because I haven't found the file. Okay, so from here, what we're going to do is we're then going to create some data. And this data is going to be import as like a string, and then we're going to slowly sort through and clean the string and all the rest of it. So we're going to try a do, try, catch. Data equals, we're going to try string contents of our URL using our file URL with file URL with path. And I'm going to use the file name or the file path that we just created. And I've got an extra bracket for some reason. Oh yeah, that's for the string, sorry. So that'll create that that string, I suppose, from that whole list of recipes, one very large string. Now our next thing that we're going to do is if there's going to be an error here, I'm going to try catch. I'm going to try printing the error, and then again returning the blank array. So I'm going to build and succeeded. So at the moment we've created a file path. We're looking for our recipes, and it's going to be saved in this variable called data. At the moment there's a warning because we've used it once, but we're actually going to go through further. So I'm then going to use this new clean rows function that I just created using our data. So it's going to reassign it. That should actually hopefully get rid of that warning. There it goes, because now we're assigning it twice. We're once just loading all the data in, and then we're going to clean up any new rows and double new lines. From there, I'm going to break the data into rows and then into columns. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable called rows. Data component separated by. This is actually very handy, especially using strings. Like you can separate a word into an array of, a sentence or a paragraph into an array of words, which is handy. So we're separating by a new line. I'm also going to count the columns. And I'm going to count them. So what I'm assuming as well is in these recipes, there's some recipes like banana cake that has some ingredients, but not a whole lot of ingredients. So I'm expecting a whole lot of blank ingredients as well. Back in recipe, I'm going to count all of our columns that we have. Then I'm going to remove the first. And the reason why is because the first one is our header row. If we were to put that in our app, it would actually have title, and that's not actually a recipe, but banana cake, the next one is. So we're going to remove the first one. Now for each row, we're then going to separate it out into columns. So we're going to use a for statement, like this is a for each, but we're not using it in a view. So in a model, it's for row in rows rather than a for each rows and then row in. So it's a bit different. I'm going to call this columns. And I'm going to take each row, and if we have a row, and we're going to use a separator, a comma, because it's a CSV. No. Rows component separated by a comma. And actually for each row, so I'm not doing the whole lot, I'm just doing one at a time. So I've separated up into columns. Now, if our columns count is equal to our column count that we've calculated up here on our header row, we have the perfect amount of data. Let this recipe, and I'm going to use the recipe, I'm going to use the one that I created, so I'm going to use this one. Now I'm going to separate these out as well, because there's like quite a lot of these. Okay, so I've separated them all out. So my next step is I'm going to look for each of those columns. I'm going to assign it to one of these things in order. So I'm going to go for columns, and I'm going to go to the first item, which is actually on a computer starting at 0. And then I'm going to paste that in and change that to 1, and then to 2, and then to 3, and so on. Okay, so we should have 59 columns, which is perfect. So I'm just going to fix all these errors before we move on. So basically, we're just looking for an integer value of that string. And I'm going to force unwrap it, so it's going to cause an issue an error if we're trying to force unwrap and it's not quite, it doesn't have the right data in the raw data. So in my CSV, if there's an error, it should fail. Feels like this is a lot of work, but you've got to consider your data source is quite broad as well. Okay, so we've now created this one very large recipe out of each row, out of each from each column in each row in our data source. So the last thing to do after we've created that is we've actually got to do something with this recipe now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this to my list of recipes by going list of recipes.append, and this is going to be this recipe. So I'm adding it to that list, and then I'm going to return that list. The last thing I'm going to do is make a global variable as a constant so it doesn't change. Recipes. Now notice this is lowercase r because it's holding data, whereas my data structure, which doesn't hold any data but sets up the type, is actually uppercase r. So that's really important. So I'm going to then use my load recipes. I'm going to build, and no problem. So now we have this global variable called recipes, and that's loaded from our recipes CSV format. So the next thing I'm going to do is move to the views. So in our views, the first thing I'm going to do in my content view is I'm actually going to create a view before that for our tab bar. So I kind of want little tabs down the bottom. So I'm going to now create a new Swift view in our views. This one is going to be called landing view. Here it is, hello world. Let's start up our preview. Here it is. Back in my app, I'm actually going to change this to my landing view instead. Build, still works. My landing view comes first. Okay, so what we're going to do in here is we're actually going to create a tab view. In here, I'm going to put my content view. Whoops. So you can see it's still existing inside the tab view, but I'm actually going to create a tab item. I'm going to add a label here. I'm going to use system images for now. So the label, this one's going to be called menu for the week. And the system image that I'm going to use is menu card. So you can see menu for the week and the little menu card. So this is now a nice little tab view. So I'll show you, this kind of looks like this. So you can kind of see you've got your tab view as we go. I'm going to add another view later on though. So again, just the one content view for now, menu for the week. Okay, so next we're going to jump into our content view and we're going to display a list of recipes. So you notice there's already this model context in here and the list of menu items that we changed before. So now inside of my body, instead of this hello world text, we're going to replace that with something more meaningful. We're going to put in a navigation view first. This allows me to put in like a navigation title as well. And I'm going to call this menu for the week. So that kind of matches the tab bar at the bottom there. Now at the moment there's an error because there's nothing inside our navigation view. So let's create a list inside of this. And for each day, all cases, now we have access to this all cases. Notice it's lowercase a. We have access to this because we used in our weekdays, we've used our case iterable, which allows us to kind of iterate or to go through this list using the all cases. We've got our weekday name, so you can see our menu for the week now. So if we go back to our landing view, you can see menu for the week matches down here as well. So that's kind of nice. Now for each of these weekday names, I'm going to create a section for that day. Raw value, because it's a string. No, it doesn't like that. So let's wrap that in some text and call it like that. Oh, you know what the problem is because I haven't opened my sections. There we go. Sunday through to Saturday. So what I'm then going to do is look for each of our items that we've saved in our data dictionary, which for now is nothing, but it's fine. Let's call this recipe selected. If the recipe selected dot day is equal to the weekday name dot raw value, because we're looking at strings here, then we're going to create the H stack of the recipe name. Okay, so we need to get the category for each recipe, and this is going to be a bit harder than just like getting the category. So I'm actually going to create a function here. So for now, I'll comment block this out. And then outside of our view, but inside our body, I'm going to create a private function to get the category. Category for recipe as a string. And I'm going to output a string that I can use then in that text field in the H stack later. So let this recipe equal, I'm going to look up the recipes in my loaded CSV spreadsheet and match it to the recipe name that I've saved in my SwiftData. So I'm looking at each one and looking for a match where the title matches the recipe. Whoops, this recipe. And then I'm going to return this recipe's category if it has one. Otherwise, I'm going to return none because there's no category on that recipe. So now I can actually put this back in my H stack in my text. I can get recipe name, get category for, what are we looking for? For the recipe selected. And we need to look up the recipe name. Make this a little bit smaller. It's going to be hard to read, but then it's all on one line. So I've got that text. I'm going to make that recipe category bold, and I'm going to make it foreground style is the new So I think it used to be foreground color. Yep, it's showing up there, but that's kind of been replaced with foreground style, but it's the same function. I'm sure there's some technical differences. And I'm going to go for secondary, which makes it gray. And then as HTAG, I'm also going to put the recipe name. So then you should see the category in bold, so it might say desserts, and it'll be gray, and then it'll have the actual name of it, so like the chocolate cake or whatever it was, banana cake. So that's it for our content view, our list of recipes that we've created. So our next step is we're going to then create a recipe list view. So in here, in our views, I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be a Swift view. Let's call this recipe list view. This is going to have a list of all of our recipes. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to save these recipes eventually to our model. So we might need to access our model. So we're going to go to Environment, Model Context. Now, for the model context, I'm going to also need to import SwiftData. And I'm going to query, or I'm going to look inside my model context for a list of menu items. So this is going to kind of match the content view. You could have actually copied this and put it in here as well. That'll be fine, just for consistency. Okay, so this text, I'm going to replace this now with, again, a navigation view, because I really like the navigation title, how simple it is to use. And I'm going to call this recipes. And for each, now remember we created this global list of recipes. So this list of recipes here, that one was actually created back here in the recipe data structure down here. So we're kind of using that in here now. For each of those recipe, I'm going to create a navigation link eventually, but for now I'm just going to create a this recipe dot title, and I want to put that in some text. So let's see what that looks like. We should hopefully see a list of recipes. Let's have a look what's going on. Because we're looking at the model context and we haven't assigned it here, so I'm just going to jump back into content view and steal the model container, copy it and paste it. Yeah, okay, I'm going to paste it down in my preview here too. Build it, looks good. Let's see if it'll run. No, that's okay. Okay, but it does build, which is good. So let's move on. Ideally, we should see a list of recipes. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a recipe detail view. In fact, I might actually put this back in my landing my landing view. So I might put in a recipe list view, and I'm going to steal this code here as our label, and I'm going to call this recipes, and I'm going to give it a value. Let's say carrot. I'm going to run this now in the actual simulator, just to check in on the data source and make sure that our recipes are actually loading from CSV. Okay, so we have our menu for our week, and hopefully, no, our quantity, fatal error. So we've got our problem with our recipes in that sometimes there's no quantities. So what we might need to do is actually, we might need to find and replace all of these at once. So to do that, I'm actually going to, let's go replace up here. I'm going to replace the exclamation point with a space, 2 question marks, another space, and a 0. And we're going to replace all. I'm going to build again. So this time we're conditionally unwrapping. So we might actually, in fact, have a problem with our data source. I'm going to see if my preview works now. It does. It's got a list of recipes with chocolate cake. If I run it, let's see what it does there. So again, I've got my list of weekdays and I've got my recipes, my chocolate cake. So that's looking good. It's loading something from our data. Not too worried that it only shows one for now. That's okay. So our last view that we're going to create is going to be our detail view. When we tap on chocolate cake, it should go somewhere. So I'm going to create our new Swift view, recipe detail view. And I'm going to go back to content view and I'm going to grab the model. Even though we didn't use it in recipe list view yet, that's fine. And I'm going to need to borrow the model container down here as well in the preview. And I'm also going to have to import SwiftData. Build that, it works fine. Now I'm also going to do a couple different things from this view. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to need to dismiss with a button eventually. I'm going to need to know which recipe I'm looking at here as well. So let's go, let this recipe be type recipe. So when I call it, now the preview won't really work for this, so I'm just going to remove it. So there's no preview. We have to test it in the simulator. So I'm going to load up a list of like a recipe. Sorry, I'm going to load this view for each recipe that I click on. I'm also going to need to know which day I've selected, and that's going to happen later as well. So we just have to use our imagination for now while we're coding. We're going to create our navigation view like before. And this one is not going to have a heading, but it will have a vertical stack. Inside that vertical stack, I'm going to put a bit of a title in here, using this recipe's title, loaded from the raw data. Make it look good. And I might actually put a spacer beside it as well. That's going to push it to the left. Then underneath all of that, I'm going to have this recipe directions. So it's going to be like how to cook it. I'm also going to put a spacer underneath. That's going to push everything to the top of the screen. So the recipe title will be at the top left because of this spacer here in the horizontal stack. And this spacer will push everything to the top. So then you'll have your directions. After that, after that space at the bottom of the view, I'm going to have a picker. And that's going to give the user a day to select from. So I'm going to direct them to pick a day. And I'm going to need to save the selection somewhere. So I'm going to have to create a state variable called selected day. I'm going to start with Monday, why not? And then that's going to be where we save whatever the user picks. Now inside this picker, I've got to set up some values. So for each of our days, so here ID self, I'm actually telling Xcode that each day is unique and to look at each day as its own unique value. And I'm going to put in the text, the raw value. And I'm going to add a tag as its own value as well. So for each day, it's going to add an element to my picker. Underneath that picker, I'm also going to put a button. It's going to do some stuff. And it's going to have some text on it. I'm going to use the star. So I'm going to use the emojis, Command Spacebar, and I'm going to use the star. Add to weekly menu. I'm also going to put some padding on this so it makes it easier to tap on. So now the button, so what we're going to do is save this recipe. So it's actually pretty straightforward. I have to create a menu item first. And I'm going to use recipe name and day. So the recipe name is going to be this recipe that we're using to create this view from. But I just need the title of it, which I'm going to assume is unique. And if not, it's going to pick the first recipe with the same name. And the day is going to be the selected day that the user's chosen, but their raw value, just the string. And to save data, this is how easy it is. We just do model context dot insert No, insert, and then we're going to put this menu item that we've just created into that. Done. The last step, I'm going to dismiss the view. So to do that, I'm going to create an environment, dismiss. I'm going to call this down here. So after we've created the menu item and we've saved it, then I'm going to dismiss this view and go back to our previous view. That'll crash in preview anyway because there's no previous view. But in our case, we're going to call this from our recipe list view. So back here, when we had this recipe title, I'm actually going to create instead a, how do we want to do this? I'm going to create a navigation link with the destination being the recipe detail view that we just created. And I'm going to need to know which recipe we're using. This recipe is going to be the same recipe as in the list here. I'll take this label out for now. And I'll put the title inside that. I'm going to run again and see what happens. So now our recipes, we've got chocolate cake and we tap on it and it opens up about chocolate cake and you can select your day and then you can add it to your weekly menu. So for Monday, if I hit add, then it dismisses the view, goes back to our list, and then our menu has cakes, chocolate cake. So that looks like that's all working. So the last thing to fix is back in recipes, why it's only showing one recipe. Let's have a look what's going on. Aha, so we haven't listed. So let's create a list with our for each inside. So now you can see our list of recipes. So I'm going to run this again. And so in recipes, you can see my best gingerbread. So I'm going to select that one and assign that to Friday. Add to weekly menu, dismisses back. Menu for the week has my best gingerbread. And we're done. How simple was that? So some points to improve on. So at the moment, we can't delete these. So it might be worth figuring out how to delete on SwiftData. That'd be something fun for students to do. The other thing you can do is add emojis for categories. And then in recipes, you might be able to filter or to search with these recipes. You might even make a little note next to each recipe to show if it's already been assigned a day of the week. Or for these days, you might actually also add if it's missing a category. So Tuesday doesn't have anything assigned to it. So that's it. So what happens now is if we close the recipes app and we reopen it, it's saved that data and it's reloaded this data. So again, so you can open this up. Another thing you might be able to add is the list of ingredients. I haven't done anything with them. That's it for now. Have fun coding.